Welcome to the Heart of Soul podcast, an exploration of who you are, what you are, and why you are, offering new ways to investigate age-old questions at the heart of you. Greetings, it's Joseph, and thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. In today's episode, we introduce the sense of the three I's: the God I, root of everything, the soul I as the child of the God I, and the local personal I as a child of the soul I. Don't worry, you don't have to figure it all out right now. That's what the podcast is for. These are esoteric structural metaphysics of Edenity itself, going upstream of what Edenity offers to more of the why it's offered. This frame serves as an introduction for a series we'll do following this on enlightenment in general and spiritually significant events of all kinds. We'll talk about the history of paradigmatic and negativization of self versus Edenity's holoarchical view that includes the self as divine, and the reasons self has been mistakenly seen as impedimentary to spirituality. Other rabbit holes include the tragedy of transcendence and the bold assertion that God is omnipresent, but not omniscient or omnipotent. Thanks so much for listening. Here we go. Okay, well, we are forward, as we say. I'm going to try to remember to stop saying back because as discussed, it's metaphysically impossible. Welcome, listeners, and welcome, Stace. Thanks for doing this again. On our agenda today is the three I's: the God I, root of everything, the soul I as the child of the God I. I'm going to say this slowly because it's dense. And the local personal I as a child of the soul I in its deconditioning/reconditioning journey as the way to open out awareness and embodiment of the soul I and the God I. And if that confused you, we're probably going to spend more than one episode on this, so you're in luck. Because right there, this is a great example of of your own complexity and depth, Stace, and how that translates into the paradigm. Because there's 3 books right there, it sounds like. So yeah. Where should we start?
Well, we can pick our rabbit hole entry, and let's frame the God I, soul I, and personal I into a little bit of a context, because for these series of podcasts we've been conversing within. We've been offering and talking about a lot of the offerings and positions that Edenity brings to the table of both metaphysical and applied human life growth. And so a lot of those positions, of course, we hold with all of them we hold with an open hand and curiosity that they might be wrong or not inapplicable to the human condition, not right or wrong. Yeah. But I'd like to frame our beginning topic here about the three I's as a ground that explains why really clearly Edenity offers what it offers as truths. In other words, we can offer what Edenity offers as truths and make good, compelling cases for them. But why do we hold them in the first place? Why does Edenity hold these in the first place? There are structural assumptions. And I'd like to build around the three I's as the structural foundation that colors and makes the positions go the direction that they go.
So we're going to talk about some esoteric metaphysics even within Edenity. Some structural metaphysics. Cool.
Exactly right. It felt like this was a moment, now that listeners have been listening a lot to what Edenity offers, but why does it offer it?
Yeah.
So we go within the within.
Which we would offer people really should be curious about, but we're not conditioned to be curious about it because most paradigms say, this is what you should do, this is what your problem is, but they don't actually reveal the metaphysics behind that, because if they did, they wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, as we've touched upon before.
Exactly right. So let's start this off by putting some focus on the most universal, we'll borrow from Ayn Rand here, bromide, that's been conditioned into the planet virtually unquestioned for about 6,000, 7,000 years. And that is that the personal is inherently impedimentary to spiritual evolution in some way. The personal is vilified as that which must either be transcended, atoned for, or outshined in order to climb a ladder of spiritual evolution, whether that is framed as higher and lower self kinds of things, or simply the vilification for original sin, original illusion, or original ignorance attributed to the natural personal. And so every religion and every spiritual teaching vilifies the personal either by degree. Of course, the pure Zen type of Buddhist traditions excoriate it wholesale. They say it's an illusion in its entire. The personal sense of self or ego is an illusion. Hindu comes in with a little softer. Hinduism, via Advaita Vedanta, its esoteric version of Hinduism, brings a little softer focus on it. It's more of a witnessless, identityless being. So it has not more substance, but a little more texture than a pure notness, or something that dualistic language actually can't capture.
Now, this is a really subtle point. I want to just tack on something here, because a lot of people I've seen hear this and will say, "Oh no, it's becoming far. That's the old way. The self is something that needs to be acknowledged and accepted." And, the ego needs to be made friends with and tolerated. They'll even use words like tolerated. So it can be really subtle. So I want to, I'm sure you have something to say about this, but my first reaction is for listeners who immediately have oh no, that's not the case in such and such paradigm. Try this on and look very carefully, because because many newer and more modernized paradigms have learned that the extreme negativization of self, one, doesn't work, and two, isn't very popular. So it's been sort of mitigated, but not actually changed.
And according to Edenity, yes.
Yes, right.
Mitigated, but not changed. So let's start with that. That's wonderful. Acceptance of ego, or the personal sense of self, is not the same as embracing it as inherently spiritual in itself.
Yeah.
Toleration or acceptance are now the buzzwords of gently acknowledging. Acknowledgement, acceptance, toleration. All you have to do is scratch the surface of that patina, and underneath it, you can ask your teacher, your favorite guru, who claims to accept it, tolerate it, or acknowledge it. But in the end, if you press the teacher or the teaching, it will say, in the end, it's an illusion. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you make it an illusion, you vilify it, even if you do it gently. Acceptance of ego does not change that it is absolutely held as an illusion, non-negotiably. Yeah. So tolerating your way, accepting or acknowledging your way in your relationship to your personal self or ego does not at all change the fact that it is held as an illusion, and that is the vilification, no matter how you dress it up.
Yeah, and there's an analog that in race relations in our society, where people talk about diversity, tolerating people of other beliefs or genders or sexual orientations or something. And I always want to say, do you want to be tolerated? Is that what you would want? Would you want to be tolerated? No, I don't want to be tolerated. There's an implicit, that's not okay, but yes, I accept you thing in there.
Exactly.
Toleration is, who would want that? You'd want to be seen and celebrated and, loved. I don't want to just be tolerated.
Right. And so exactly right. And the idea here is acceptance, acknowledgement, or toleration is not embracement. Embracement of the personal as the foundation for spiritual evolution, not its tolerated impedimency.
Yeah, which comes from the completely opposite side of things.
Opposite side of things. Now, how did this? Let's go down the road of how did this develop?
Mm-hmm.
What bigger contexts allowed this boil on the butt of humanity relative to coin a phrase? I grew up in Chicago. What can I say?
Well, you should transcend your personal Chicago conditioning, don't you know? Because that's just impedimentary to your path as a spiritual teacher.
Absolutely. That's completely unfoldable into spiritual alacrity and acuity.
That you would say a boil on the butt, that's evidence of your lack of enlightenment and evolution, of course, right?
Oh, of course, yes. That's too prejudicial and banal.
Base,
to be part of an enlightened consciousness.
And that's a sidebar here, and that's why many people will listen to you for 5 minutes and go, "Oh, well, this guy's not awake. He's not enlightened because he uses colorful language like that."
Right.
And because the Adidas and the Adyashantis and the Ram Dassas of the world, they didn't talk like that because we would offer because they'd not that they weren't awake at all, but because they'd left some of their personal behind in a way that was in a tolerance kind of dynamic, in a negativization dynamic.
Yes, in that way, tolerance, acknowledgement, and acceptance are still a negativization of the personal sense. Right. So colorful language, Identity offers this radical new notion. Take your ego and personal sense of self along the journey as its foundation. So how did it become that erstwhile butt boil on the butt of humanity? Well, 3 reasons. One is that all the teachings, whether it's religious on the Western side or more spiritual, esoteric on the Eastern side, these are all axial age incepted paradigms. As such, they are unavoidably, historically, and completely pre-psychological.
Yeah.
Because there was no psychological alacrity, no psychological subtlety to the personal sense of ego, it was seen as the wholesale impediment. It became an entity in itself. It is when really sensitive spiritual teachers looked at the problems and suffering of humanity, it was looked like the ego, the small sense of self, the over-attachment to the self, the smaller self, the ego, whatever you want to call it, was the font of all the problems and the sufferings. So it was not an uninspired position to take, that the personal sense of being, with all its over-attachments, over-indulgements, greeds and downsides and negative emotivity, all that stuff, that was the problem. Well, we tend to forget. We kneel at the altar of ancient religions and spiritual teachings because, well, look, they've endured for 2,000-3,000 years. They must be right, or else they wouldn't endure that far.
Yeah, but so is the subjugation of women. That's endured as well.
Exactly right. All of them, East and West, of course, are patriarchal, and that's no accident. So pre-psychological made the ego bad because they didn't understand, as Identity would offer in the present day, that it is wounding within the ego or the personal self that is the cause of all the problems, not the ego itself. So it's a retail situation, not a wholesale situation.
And it's a baby in a bathwater issue, as so many things are.
You bet. So that's the first contributor, that ego was the ego, the villainization or vilification of ego happened because of a pre-psychological ignorance of the complexity of the human consciousness.
And it's actually, I think about this a lot related to the evolution of consciousness, how difficult it is to go back in time consciousness wise, and like I wish I could think like someone from like 600 AD for a day just to try that on, because like I think we talked about this before, but like the ideas of projection or hidden motives or even that's conditioning. From my research, the idea of personal conditioning didn't show up in Western philosophy until like late in the Renaissance.
Yes, correct.
And then that became the foundation for psychology. But prior to like 1750 or so, people didn't think in terms of, oh, you think this way because you've been conditioned to think that way, and that's not actually the case. The idea of a personal filter for reality was not the way we thought at all. And many people, as evidenced by that, many people still don't think that way.
About 60-70% of the planet still are stuck in that place. And if you take that one step further, about in terms of condition to think a certain way or be a certain way or have a certain opinion, the whole idea of unconscious motivation didn't arise until Freud and Adler and Jung got together. Didn't get together, but started our journey into the nature of the unconscious. The unconscious is where all of our motives originate. And most 80%, 70% of our unconscious motives are wounds. And when someone says, well, mine aren't, and people have said that to me in talks and seminars, and all I can say is, hence the term unconscious.
Yeah.
You have to, psychology, the best it can do about dipping into the unconscious wounded motives that make ego impedimentary to spiritual evolution, requires a proactive kind of algorithm. And psychology in general doesn't have very good proactive frameworks for exploring the unconscious. You've got free association, you've got the smudge marks, you've got hypnosis, you've got a few of these things, but none of these are exhaustively proactive. Mm-hmm. The unconscious is unconscious for a reason, because it threatens our conditioned normal states of being, as dictated by our social contracts, our religious teachings, and our spiritual orientations, right? So the nature of the unconscious was completely unconscious to axial age inceptors of all of our major religions and spiritual perspectives.
We're talking about this fairly casually, but I just want to stop and, like, this is a literally awesome point of view, like to look at all of the axial age religions and basically any set of a philosophy, spirituality, religion, even a personal empowerment type thing that was created prior to around 1900 necessarily had a giant piece of the human condition completely missing, and yet is still being used. I mean, that's like a keyboard with 5 letters missing. There's just certain things that can't happen ever. Oh,
nice metaphor. Yeah, nice point. Thanks for bringing that. We talk about it. For me, it's second nature, a default, but it needs to be brought to a much more general awareness for the planet to move ahead with its own world CQ, consciousness quotient.
I'm sorry to keep interrupting you, but I'm too excited about this. I was just talking with someone recently, a really lovely, noble Catholic fellow, and to see how he was relating to personal conflict related to forgiveness. And to see that paradigm, and it was like to actually witness in real time, like, oh, he's relating to personal conflict and forgiveness through a lens that completely excludes the unconscious contributions from the two people involved.
Yes.
And just to see how there's this big piece missing, and that only really took a little bit to get to, but again, the faithfulness, to sort of make a pun here, to a pre-psychological paradigm, it just leaves out this enormous thing that is, it's weird because in one way, psychology is it's trickling down into common sense, but at the same time, we have these, multiple 1,000-year-old paradigms that are clung to, and the dissonance, it's like sometimes I think I wake up in the middle of the night feeling it because it's not good, and it's causing problems.
Yeah. The only reason there's been a persistence and a non-questioning of the paradigmatic limitations of anything coming from the axial age, which is all of them. The only reason that there hasn't been any proactive confrontation of this is there was no alternative.
Right.
No spiritual paradigm ever arose that confronted the limitations of the axial age ignorance, right? Mm-hmm. Innocent ignorance. And before a listener starts thinking that Edenity is criticizing them as null and void and inapplicable, we're not. We're just saying there's an inherent limitation to a pre-psychologically incepted spiritual paradigm, deep limitations. But there is truth in every one of our axial age religions. There is truth, but we have to separate the wheat from the chaff, because their ignorance will lead you to a dead end if you're in a certain lifetime and a certain how many incarnations you've had.
And every new thing implicitly or explicitly criticizes the thing before it. Buddhism was a criticism of Hinduism. Yes. Islam was a criticism of the polytheistic tribal societies of the time. So you just that's just how it goes. Something new always goes against.
Yeah, Judaism against paganism,
right.
Historically. So the vilification of the ego, that's the number one reason impeding the vilification of the personal self. And that came from pre-psychological paradigm inception. The second contributor to that is what we talked about in one of our first or second podcasts about hierarchy versus holoarchy. When you're considering the spectrum of consciousness, let's say, it has sorted itself out inside of that vilification, or as an expression of the vilification of the personal, that ego, the small self, relative to the vastness of the kind of consciousness domains that are accessible in advanced spiritual evolution, renders, from a hierarchical point of view, the lower self or the smaller self at the bottom. Looking at hierarchy, which is all the mind can do, as we had said before, when you array the spiritual consciousness gradation, Wilber's does this, there's a hierarchy, inherent hierarchy, even if he wants to call it something else. The hierarchy, a hierarchical overlay, like a piece of acetate over the assumptions of a paradigm, is going to be arranged hierarchically. And one way in that hierarchical, the personal self or the ego gets the basement. This is another reason why it has never been seen as the foundation. You're looking at the same thing, but they see it as the basement, less than the vastness of greater coarctations of consciousness.
It's sort of like in a hierarchical company. There was a hierarchical org chart. You can say, well, we're all equal here and everybody has a voice, but everybody knows the CEO is making the final decision. And
exactly.
No matter what you say, that hierarchy is going to negativize in some way, shape, or form. The people at the bottom have less power. It doesn't matter what you say or how many donuts you buy them.
Exactly right. But I love that metaphor, because a basement to a hierarchy is a foundation for a holoarchy. It's really a pretty picture. In other words, spiritual consciousness, human consciousness, whether we're talking about the personal I, the soul I, or the God I, as we'll get to, is arranged holoarchically, not hierarchically. And in a holoarchy, that which is inside of something is also inside of it. In other words, we're inside of God, and God is inside of us. That you hear that all the time.
Yeah.
But without getting the ramification of that, is that's a holoarchical. That's only possible in a holoarchy. In a hierarchy, that which is inside of can't be inside of it. If I'm on the sixth floor of a 10-story building, if I'm on the sixth floor, the 10th floor can't be inside the sixth floor. Very simple.
Nor can the building be inside you.
No, correct. More or less. That's another interesting rabbit hole.
Yeah.
But so when you recognize the limitations of a pre-psychological paradigm based in hierarchical overlay architecture of consciousness, the second point here supports the first one, that ego or personal sense of the self is the bottom of the pyramid, the lowest floor.
So you'd say, like in Christianity, for example, when people say, well, Jesus is inside you, that's an appeal or like an approximation of a holoarchical point of view, but it's not actually embodied and not actually part of the metaphysics.
No, because in Christianity, there's a very hierarchical, there's a heaven there, there's a hell down there, and humans are somewhere between the angels and the animals. In terms of consciousness, that's all hierarchical. So just because they say Jesus is inside you is only a headline, as it is only half a headline, because the God, the nothing can be outside of God. If God is God, nothing can be outside of it. They're not different. They're not different, fundamentally different domains, heaven, hell, earth. Whereas in hierarchical configurations in spirit and east and west, they are different domains of not just of consciousness, but of actual structure. The afterlife is a different structure than the incarnative life, for example. There's a continuum, a spectrum, that nothing can be outside of God, so everything's inside of God. So there's one half of the holoarchy. We're inside of God at all moments. We start every moment in God. We are with God, inside of God. Every action and every outcome, we can never get outside of it. And we can also find that the God within, the divine spark within, there's the other half of the holoarchy. So the combination, the ego and personal sense has been vilified for two reasons we've summarized. Now we'll go on to the third, because it's pre-psychologically incepted in every spiritual and religious context. Every spiritual and religious context is formatted basically, with a few exceptions, hierarchically. And that adds to the vilification or basementification of the personal ego self. And the third is the result of the first two, and what that is, ego and advanced spiritual growth are excluvational, not incluvational.
They're
In other words,
paths.
They're separate paths. Mm-hmm. It shakes out from the first two contributions to the third that one cannot include the other. If the self or personal ego is deemed an illusion, it can't inclusivate, even though some pictures of Wilber's version of things say that the ego is developmentally part of the spectrum, but in the end, it's left behind completely.
And this would be why we would suspect that most of Tony Robbins' students and clients are atheists and agnostics, because it's one track or the other. They're excluvational. Exactly
right. Mm-hmm. So that point of being exclusive of active participation and continuity with advanced spiritual consciousness are made excluvational. And in the end, then, if all these are true, as offered by Edenity, it ends up that transcendence, now's the result of these three, transcendence of the personal is one of the most tragic errors ever invented by human consciousness. Mm-hmm. If it is a holoarchical situation, the personal I is untranscendable, because it is the foundation Identity offers for all the rest. My personal ego is part of God. It's sacred in itself, because nothing can be outside of God. Even ego can't be outside of God. Even when the ego does evil. Here, let's take a short rabbit hole. Evil is inside of God. Mm. evil comes from God because everything comes from God. Now, here's another identity red flag for a lot of folks. Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Because we wind up doing the evil, and we're inside of God, so evil is inside of God. What's the capacity in God? What exists as a capacity in God that allows us to make evil out of our choices? What is that? And Identity has an answer. It says it offers that the capacity for us to do evil is set up in divine being as it's unfolding into the unknown of itself. The unknown of itself. But unknown terrifies human consciousness. It terrifies it. But for God, it's just divine being. What is conscious? Divine being is conscious. It's not a he or a she. It's both. It's feministically now to call her a she. It's both. It's both. Is self-aware, and Identity offers a genesis, a new form of genesis to explain why that is.
Does the divine have an unconscious?
Yes. We would say, now let's put it in a slightly different frame, Joseph. Great lead there. What are the three omnis that most religious points of view offer God is, right?
Oh, those omnis. I was like, what? Yeah, omnipresent,
omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient.
Yeah,
right. Knows everything, is all powerful, and is always present. Right. Identity says, sorry, that's not our take. The only one of those omnis is that God is omnipresent. It is omnipresent, it can't not be. But inside of it, as fingers on our soul hand, which is attached to a God body, where it's all one thing, one continuity, our personal in that way. Our capacity to do evil comes from God always is unfolding and evolving, or else how could we unfold and evolve? God is evolving.
Yeah, because we're evolving. If we're an aspect of God and we have an unconscious, that's sort of like if one end of the stick is wood, so is the other end. It's all the same thing.
Great metaphor, yes. So that renders God's omnipotence and omniscience null and void. Now, relative to us, it seems all-knowing and all-powerful. But why, if it's omnipotent, why doesn't it stop evil? Well, the standard Christian might say, well, because we're supposed to decide between Satan's agenda and Jesus's agenda, right? And it's up to us. It lets us create evil, so we learn. Well, we would agree in that way that divine being, it doesn't let us, like Islam or Christianity might say, it's always unfolding to itself into a new unknown. That's its version. And that unknown, as it trickles down to the other end of the stick, as you said, to our personal, we're terrified of the unknown. What we call evil, no matter what domain you'd like to frame that in, all comes because we're terrified of some unknown. And in our case, that can be found in the unconscious as that trickles upward into our everyday choices through the unconscious motives. So if God is only omnipresent and non-omniscient, this scares the shit out of lots of devotional-based people. It's the universe all of a sudden isn't safe if God isn't all-knowing and all-powerful. It has never been safe, folks. It's never been safe. We are the point of the spear of divine beings, most on the ground, rubber meets the road version of itself. And we're terrified of the unknown. The more we become known to ourselves, more self-aware, explore our unconscious and unfold it to conscious, the less it bothers us that God doesn't have omniscience or omnipotence.
And there's a kind of obvious analogy there because probably everybody can remember where they were as children or as teenagers when they realized that their parents didn't know everything.
Yes.
I certainly
Oh,
remember.
nice.
It was
Yeah.
mythos in my family because my father was really good at Trivial Pursuit. It was like, oh, he knows everything because he would win every time. And then I started to ask questions like, wait a minute, what? Because as children, we need literally to believe that our parents know everything so that we can feel safe. But if we're ever going to be empowered individuals, we have
As
to
adults.
realize that they don't. And
Right.
they're both necessary phases of development.
The day that my own connect with divinity's voice and presence had a certain critical mass, and it unfolded this to me that it is only omnipresent, not omniscient, for exactly these, and omnipotent for exactly these reasons. I wept in relief because it is only when we hold it as omniscient that we ask the question, why does God allow evil in the world? Or omnipotent, all-knowing and all-powerful.
Which is
Take those
existential
away.
Victimhood, too. It's not a good place to be.
Talk about a depthful form of victimhood, right?
Yeah.
So it's really, we need to believe that God's omnipotent and omniscient to be safe while we're in early incarnational spectra of consciousness, right? But the older soul that you become over time, which is the number of incarnations in Earth that we've had, that's older, younger, and older. These kinds of things no longer serve us, which is why elder souls tend not to be drawn to axial age religions, East or West.
You know, honestly, I haven't heard you talk about this before, and it's shaken me a little bit. Like I can feel there was some unconscious sense I had. I don't know if you'd asked me before we had this conversation, is God omniscient and what's the other one?
Omnipotent.
Omnipotent and omniscient. I don't know what I would have said, but I wouldn't have been as clear as you've been clear now, and I feel it doing something with me. Like it's shaking loose, like a kind of like I'm really on my own in a way that I didn't feel before, and there's an empowering feeling to it, but there's also a fear, like that some part of me really didn't want that to be the case.
Thanks for being so transparent there, Joseph. I've seen people when I've talked casually about this, it's not casual to them at all.
No.
And it's the big gulp. I see.
Yeah.
It's the big,
yeah,
the
it's a
big
gulp,
gulp.
totally.
But let's go one step more into the substance of it. That assurance we had in God's omniscience and omnipotence is a false relationship.
Oh boy, right. Because you can never relate with the actual divine then, because you've got a completely made up picture of it. Wow.
For me, losing God, divinity relaying in the way that it does in our communications, that it's not omniscient nor omnipotent. My first Gestalten reaction after I wept in relief. Why am I relieved? Because now I can have a real relationship with it. All of us are equal points of it on its sphere in this. I'm going to knock on purpose in this domain. We are the spear points. Our root is a God eye. It doesn't make us equivalent to God, but we are mini gods at the point of the spear of the divine eye of God. Our soul eye and our personal eye are downline versions of that in a holoarchy. So when you realize you're losing a false relationship based on a fictitious daddy who makes everything safe and he's all knowing, can guide you and everything, we're on our own as we should be, because and again, this triggers a lot of people, we're little mini gods because our eye is connected upline to the God eye. So it's a degree thing, not a separate hierarchical domain. We're all in this together. And I love that metaphor. Here's our personal eye, and I'm showing my little finger on the hand of our soul eye, where we have many incarnations of self. But that soul umbilicus by the forearm connects us to the body of God, out of which we are emerging every moment. And as we emerge every moment and unfold ourselves, God is unfolding through us. Every other species on the earth, animal, vegetable, or mineral, however you want to say it, God can unfold through effortlessly. We're the only species on the planet, because we're capable of non-entropy, we're the only species where it hits a dead end. It can't move through us because we don't let it, by A, making the personal I a problem, B, making the soul I either infected by original sin or an illusion. It can't come through apertures of our soul I and our personal I to evolve itself into the human condition, except to be its container. It's its container, but wants to come through our species, just like it can every other species, which is why we love animals as pets. We can find a safe animal that isn't going to eat us.
Because good prerequisite for a pet, yeah.
Prerequisite, yes. But a pet, God can come through a pet a lot easier than you, folks. Every one of you out there, every one of us starts out being impedimentary to God when we define the personal as impedimentary. One end of the straw is closed, and divine being's breath can't come down through the straw to be exhaled into the human condition.
So if you could ask a cat, is being a cat impedimentary to the divine? What would it say if it could answer?
It would say, wait, are you making a distinction between that which I am swimming in and that which I am? We're literally fish in water saying the water doesn't exist. Or where's the water? Where's the water? Where's God? Where's God? We're in it every moment. All the religions that attempt to religate, the base of religion, religate you to God, have failed to the point where, unless you have a direct experience of God, how many religious people have a direct, not a belief, not a faith, a direct experience of God because of their religion's rituals?
But ironically, many religions, I think all of the big five would say, God is everywhere, God is here, you are God, but they don't. But then in the next paragraph, it's hierarchicalized, and somehow you're in the way of that. It sort of depends on the moment.
It does, and that's why they don't cohere. The domains of the teachings of religions fight with each other paradigmatically. So when they can't. God is everywhere, but the ramifications of that never make it down to the personal, because the personal is the font of all evil. Because even though you didn't do anything, you're infected with original sin, because Adam and Eve, as we talked a couple times before, Eve liked apples. She was the one who was
her
brave
personal
enough.
Preference, very personal.
Her personal,
apples.
God, personal preference. Look out. Adam was actually in my picture, in Edenity's picture of things. Adam, in that moment, kind of lacked the cojones. He thought it was a test. Inside this myth. He thought it was a test, and Eva was the one that had the cojones in this. Again, cojones, boil on the butt. I must not be enlightened, right?
Right, no, it's way too personal.
Yeah, exactly. Eva was the one that said, hey, I want to eat of the tree of self-knowledge. And Adam said, are you sure? Are you sure? Yeah, come on, you're the guy.
I never thought about that. The desire for self-knowledge, that's a personal self-interest, which was negativized from the very start. I never made that connection.
Yeah. See, it's inherent. When you decode these myths, you find this dark antipathy for the personal. Everything must be obeyed like robots, which is why sensitive, intelligent people become atheists. They don't have any other alternative. Somebody once said to me in a talk I gave that you should market to atheists. A lot of people want to be spiritual, but have no framework that they can put their doubt of God in. And I say, you're right. I don't know how to market to them because they have thrown out the childish fairy tales. And thank God you have to throw off the fairy tales that guide your life to one day evolve. Not when you're younger souls. Those fairy tales are the gentle bedtime stories for children, and we need to have those to move through. We're not vilifying them, but middle-aged souls and older souls, more than 450 lifetimes here in the last 130,000 years, since we're all linked by the same mitochondria from a 130,000-year-old mother. I can't be enlightened. I'm being an anthropological physicist, a genetic physicist, I guess.
Yeah, that's way too dualistic.
Way too dualistic. Yeah. So we just taking that tact as to close this part of it is dualism is part of God. Mm-hmm. It's the way God expresses itself in dense domains of its expression. This whole physical universe made up of dark energy, dark matter, vacuum, and matter, regular matter, is all one tier of consciousness it's called in the bigger picture of things the Terran universe. It's the most dense universe there is. There isn't one more dense than this. We occupy the most dense version of the God field, as it were. But the refraction of colors, technicolor, everything is in bas relief to the nth degree in this dimension, the suffering and the joyfulness. Other souls that inhabit the other domains, we will talk about soul species that do come here. They want to come here because they can embody all the colors and the textures of love and hate and connection and devotion and self-realization.
It's the widest range of experience.
The widest and deepest range of experience. Mm-hmm. So when there's an old adage, I wish I knew who said this.
Like Joseph. Going to Las Vegas.
Oh, no. Well, some souls in other domains do call this
Las Vegas
tacky kitschy, like that. But somebody once said angels. What was it? Angels envy men their pain.
Yeah, like in what's that Meg Ryan movie?
Not Leaving Las Vegas. That's
same actor Cage.
Though.
He becomes
L.A. I mean, that's where the angels.
He's an angel. They're all at the beach, and he becomes human, and then she dies. But his initial experience of being human is just he's in rapture of actually feeling, because all the angels are portrayed as sort of above it all, and their range of emotions and experience is kind of narrow. It's sort of like being on antidepressants or something. It's sort of this middle place that's not very extreme, not particularly interesting, not very varied, which of course many humans would kill for, and often will do crazy things to try to get to, but that's not the point of being human, we would say.
I would say yes. And let's make
Nicolas Cage and Meg Ryan.
Nicolas Cage and Meg Ryan, yeah.
Google.
That's why I always said Leaving Las Vegas. I was thinking of Nick.
Right.
But let's talk about that just for a quick sidebar, because we're going to come to a summation here. Mm-hmm. And that is that about 13% of the overall Earth population are angels in human form. This is not a myth. This is not supernatural. Angels, there's 4 different species of angels, each one more dense than the other, and they are all incarnatable here on Earth. In fact, one of the tiers of them were the first consciousnesses to start inhabiting the bodies that were developed in the animal kingdom, the ape line, in our case, bipedal quadrupeds. So angels can incarnate here. And a lot of times when we do seminars and talk about soul species, everybody, am I an angel soul? Am I an angel soul? There's a big self-image about it. And I just want to say that angel souls suffer the most here. It's much like not not going into a nitrogen-inducing tank before a deep dive, where you have to acclimate the pressure in your body so you can take a deep dive. Mm-hmm. The first few incarnations here, angels suicide like crazy because they have to gradually make the descent into this level of density, right? Mm-hmm. So there are angel souls in the earth. It's not a myth. You've likely met one in your life. You've probably met several, but 13% of 7.5 billion. I don't do math very well these days.
Maybe 700 million, right?
Something like that, or 70 million. 7.5 million. Whatever. I can't do when it gets past a certain amount of zeros.
It's not easy for me either.
My non-dual.
Yes, because you're so enlightened. That's why you can't do that. It's too dualistic.
Because non-dualistic is a zero, right? It's so I get too many zeros and I get a little crazy. So anyway, this wonderful way of looking at things, that God is not omniscient, or omnipotent, liberates us to finally grow up instead of being just obedient little children made safe by the presence of God. When you start actually encountering the real God, it's terrifying. Mm-hmm. It's terrifying because you look into a blank hole at first until something fills in, because you're having to form a new box in your understanding to incorporate an applied God in your everyday life instead of a distant God you have to have faith in.
And that's right? In scripture, when Muhammad came down from the cave, he told his wife, "Cover me." He was an emotional wreck. I believe the same with Moses. There's a lot of accounts of people being terrified by the quote sight of God,
made insane in some way. So this is a gradually opening up thing that Edenity offers steps 3 different domains to unfold yourself, so you can be conscious every day that every moment I walk in, it's about 97% now for me. I'm walking in God every moment. And I'm in God. Why would I worry except from my own unhealed place about anything? No one ever gets totally healed, myself included. It's always an asymptote. We're never done. That assurance, that ability to consciously walk in God every moment, not just have episodic events, but as an everyday thing, that's the goal. Mm-hmm. That's the end game in Edenity. When we talked about paradigms, we always said, well, one of the last elements is, what do they define as the highest state of consciousness? Mm-hmm. And I just enumerated the highest state of consciousness. We call that enlightenment. Not enlightenment, enlightenment, where you walk every day in God as a part of God, unfolding within God as you unfold out of yourself into yourself.
Not to attempt to toot my own horn or anything, but just as a testament to Stace's ability to replicate that consciousness in other people, I can say that before I met you, I did not have that experience at all. And I don't know what percentage I would give myself. I wouldn't even try. But I do have, I'd say, I don't know, a somewhat abiding experience of the divine, or a here and there. It's definitely a way different than before I met you and did that work. And that's what, to me, one of the most amazing things about Edenity is. Like, would you like to substitute or supplant your belief or disbelief with the divine with an actual ongoing experience and self-verifying experience like that? There's actually a map to get there for those who are willing to face the terrors that it entails.
Yes, we'll talk about that in another podcast, the terrors. Mm-hmm. But I do this kind of thing for people, just so they know. You are at 37.8.
I knew you were going to do that. Yeah, that fits about right. It's not more than half the time. That sounds about right.
No, but this is much that those percentages are just like the Richter scale. They're not arithmetic; they're geometric.
Yeah, right.
And
what I would share about that too, because it might be interesting for people. Like when I feel into that idea, it brings up terror. Like it's 37.8% is a lot to manage, and when I inside myself, if I lean toward more, it comes up like I don't know if I could handle any more than that. It's really not easy. and it takes a lot of time to integrate and digest. It's not like some light switch. It's not an easy path, but it's so worth it.
Thanks for the testament. Without self-verification, we're not in a rationally cohering paradigm. No beliefs allowed in identity. No beliefs allowed. Faith, if you equate faith, we have to replace also, we would say, faith with trust. Faith still has fear in it. There's hope that we will be sated or taken care of with faith. Trust, there's no hope in it. It's already a done deal.
Well, and to tie it back, the faith and that hope, it's the faith is in the omniscient and omnipotent God.
Yes. Yeah, right.
And
right.
that's part of the I don't know, I feel a quivering in me about it. It's like, because you're putting your eggs in a basket that is not impotent and not omnipotent and not omniscient. And so it's sort of like, it's way more powerful than you are, but you can experience that it doesn't know everything. And so what is it you're hitching your wagon to exactly? You don't know where that's going to take you. It's not safe.
You're not really. Another way to say that, I love how you put that, because you're not a participating expression of God while you faith believe it is omniscient and omnipotent. You are literally locked out of being an active presence of it.
Yeah.
Omniscience and omnipotence completely require belief and faith and never immediate access to the living God.
And Meister Eckhart from 1,300 years ago, and he said the belief in God inhibits your experience of it. Would agree.
One of my favorite guys.
Yeah.
So we just gave an overall bigger picture of how the God I is configured and our relationship to it, with the personal I being vilified and not given its own grown-up ability while it still believes in omniscience and omnipotent God. But let's just parse to complete here. Let's parse the personal I in a very important way, so that we can build on that in the next podcast or two. We can parse the personal I. Even psychology and philosophy have very little knowledge of what I'm going to say next. This is as paradigm shattering for psychology and philosophy as what we've been saying is to religion. And of course, we'll also bring in the esoteric Eastern Zen stuff here in the next podcast or two, what happens in enlightenment and why it's so problematic for most people after attaining it. The idea here is the personal I that psychology has no idea about, and philosophers too, is that there are two main dimensions to the personal I by default. There is an emotively inauthentic version of ourselves and a soulful-based, emotively authentic aspect. We think when we know ourselves, we know our history, we know what kind of meal we like on what kind of sandwiches or what we believe in. Your operating aware sense of self is only, for most people, a little less than 1/3 of your actual true nature. Your actual true nature, the other 2/3 of it's unconscious to you because you were conditioned to learn how to be an emotively inauthentic version of yourself that in the average person, I've never seen an exception. I've worked with hundreds and observed thousands and thousands of people in a long life. No one is exempt from this. No one, not enlightened people, not people in big authorities or leadership positions. Everyone is operating out of a 1/3 inauthentic and 2/3, 1/3 authentic, 2/3 inauthentic version of self.
Which of course would explain why they wanted to throw the whole thing out, because it was accurately observed that the majority of people is problematic, right? Yes. That would just fit.
What psychology doesn't get is that, and spirituality doesn't get, the ones that seek therapy and do therapy are operating out of their two-thirds inauthentic version of selves.
Yeah.
So when you go to a psychologist and it helps you, the psychologist or the psychiatrist or therapist or a coach helps you make different choices, you're actually muscularizing your inauthentic self to become more functional, or to make your dreams come true better. All of your aspirations, all of your dreams, all of your goals, all of what you call success and failure is defined in two-thirds measure by your inauthentic version of self that is unconscious to you. This is why, unless we do a proactive, not a reactive exploration of our unconscious, we will never liberate ourselves to our soulfully sourced, emotively authentic version of self.
And also the frame, and I think about this a lot, like with Jung's original teaching and Freud, and before him Boyer. I mean, what most therapists seem to be doing is they're helping people to cope better. That's
Yes.
even a word they'll use, and we would immediately say, well, if the coping is necessarily I forget what language the inauthentic self is attempting to cope better with the wounds rather than actually healing the wounds. But did none of the original teachers in psychology think in terms of actually healing the wounds? There must have been some of that, no?
There was never any protocol that was paradigmatically defined as the way to heal why we have to learn to cope.
Yeah, right. Because then they would have said that instead of, because what do we have these words like when you, is it not subjugate, subordinate? What's it? Some kind of what's the word where you sublimate? Yes, and sublimation is seen as a positive thing, right? Instead of getting angry, you go hit the punching bag, and that's a good thing. We look for coping skills to some degree to transfer the wound-based thing into a more functional issue, but not proactively go looking for why there's a coping mechanism necessary in the first place.
Exactly. Sublimation is conditioning, is affected by conditioning. In our case, in Identity's opinion, sublimation is repression.
Right.
But there's a ostensible good reason for it. Are you saying, Stace, that we should all go around feeling all of our untamed feral kinds of emotivity? Yeah, that's right. But that requires a safe space with a safe person in a paradigm that knows how to lead you to your feral, uncontrollable, negative, quote unquote, emotionality, safely process them to healed emotionality.
Oh, yeah, I just made that link because sublimation, it's repression in a paradigm that negativizes the self necessarily.
And negativizes negative emotion. The first book I wrote, my first book was titled, There's No Such Thing as a Negative Emotion. That alone is paradigm shattering. Mm-hmm. Every psychological, philosophical, and spiritual and religious paradigm has their version of negative emotions. They think they're possible.
And there's no such thing as a negative emotion doesn't mean accept, tolerate, abide with. It means following it all the way back to its origin and get to know it intimately and lovingly, which is not what most people are doing, even if they say they are.
If you try to transcend or cope over or sublimate negative emotions, they don't go away. They just get buried to come out later this life sideways in another form, another illness, or carried into the next life as seeds for the same kind of repetitious loop. We've got to face down the animal cage packed with feral animals of our negative emotions and see that they all have a reason. They're red flags for us. They're not to be sublimated, repressed, transcended, or accepted. We have to follow, as you said, follow them back to why they're quote unquote negative in the first place. And it all comes to woundings, unconscious woundings. Yeah. So the one who is seeking enlightenment is 2/3 inauthentic. That is, you will only attain at most 2/3 of your capacity to enlighten, because the very one wanting to enlighten is the one that's in the way of enlightenment. The very one who goes to therapy and tries to gets empowered, whether it's the Tony show or the Tom show in Scientology, whatever the show is. You have to find yourself. The one who is doing the work is in the way of the work. And this is not clear to philosophy in general. It's not clear to psychology or psychiatry, that the very one going to therapy is in the way of therapy, because your therapist is also co-signing your inauthentic version of self to some degree, not total degrees. We're not running down therapy. It's been revolutionary for our consciousness of the planet, but it's inherently and structurally limited because. Go ahead.
Sorry, there is some appreciation of that in Zen. I remember a phase in Adyashanti was, I would say, my teacher for 5 or 6 years, and there was a phase where I was confronted with how the needing to let go of the seeker, and that the seeker was impedimentary, and I don't know how to put words around how that's different, but I'm sure you can.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's a good headline. There's truth in every paradigm. There's a good truth. The seeker is in the way of enlightenment. Mm-hmm. But in the end, the seeker is an illusion. And here we're saying the seeker is not an illusion. It's a very alive, extant being who's just wounded. So in that sense,
oh God.
See, does that make sense how that all links up? I just got to
digest that for a second, because I whatever I did with my seeker during that time was not emotionally processed. It was transcended, and that hurts. That makes me sad to feel that.
You can't transcend anything authentic. You can only transcend inauthentic versions of yourself. And there's the inherent limitation in all the models of enlightenment there is. I feel it, Joseph. You abandon him.
Yeah.
But you were taught to.
Yeah.
By innocently, by a better than average teacher, Adyashanti is, himself suffering these days terribly, so much so that he has to take a sabbatical. Bless his heart. He's hit his limits, his own paradigm, and he doesn't know he's hit the limits of his paradigm. He thinks he's just exhausted for some reason.
Yeah.
But he's hit the limits of his own paradigm and doesn't know it. I respect him so much. I would so wish to help him in his travails at the moment. But the seeker is in the way. The therapy is in the way. The therapist is in the way, because until we have more authentic, emotively authentic self than inauthentic self, we're part of the problem for the CQ of the race of our whole planet, and it's not its solution. And that emotively inauthentic, emotively authentic, the rubric behind that is that we are emotive beings first, willful beings second, mental beings third, and physical beings fourth. That's Edenity's offering. In other words, the primary tincture or substance of human consciousness is emotive. Emotive. Not energetic, not willful, not mental, and not corporeal. That assumption shatters everything we think we know about the human condition. No one has ever offered, with an associating dharma. Bree Brown is fine, or what's her name? Brene Brown.
Yeah.
It's finally coming around to the headline, hey, I think we're emotion beings first. Back in the 80s, as I said in another podcast, when the brand new baby internet, I was the only person on the internet saying there's no such thing as a negative emotion, based on the rubric that we're emotional beings first. There's somebody in France that published a book in France that I feel, therefore I am, believe it or not. My version of the book, of course, is we feel, therefore we are. But that is a paradigm shatterer right from the beginning, that we are emotively configured first in human consciousness. Then we're willful. Then we're mental, abstracting our emotive willfulness. And then we're physical.
Yeah, and while we're on that... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, while we're on that subject, I find it really validating of Edenity that while Edenity is absolutely unique, there are a lot of other paradigms who are putting emotion as being a whole lot more important than before. It's not the only one. There seems to be a kind of rising tide that is seeing how repressive it was, and none of them, as far as I know, have as complete a map and have thought it through as well. But there's a lot.
There's again, like we started this whole podcast about accepting self.
Yeah.
They're accepting emotion is a lot more important than they thought, but none of them are saying it is the primary aspect of human consciousness.
Yeah, that it's intrinsic. I don't know.
It's intrinsic. That. And where does the last point, we can move to close for today. Mm-hmm. I would offer that's not based on just a belief of mine. If what we started this podcast, for listeners who are still with us.
Congratulations if you are.
Yes, congratulations, you're still here. Is that whatever divine being is in its magnificence, its structure that we can never know because we're children of it. We're downline tips of the spear of its upline reality. Divine being is love. All the great teachers have said that, but they never got the ramifications of that. If divine being is made of love, love is an emotive dynamic, not a mental one, not a willful one, not a physical one. It's an emotive dynamic. And if it's emotive first, love, made of love, so are we.
That's the associative property, I believe.
Yeah, that's top math. One end of the stick is connected to the other end of the stick, right? Mm-hmm. And so if that's the case, if we are forever in God, acting out God, expressing God, and ending up in God every moment, so are we made of love first, which is emotive. So this is a coherent link up between the assumption of what divine being is made of and how intimately we're a version of it while it's inside of us at the same time, that the translation of that where the rubber meets the road, I just hit for emphasis on the table there, where the rubber meets the road means we're emotive first as love children of a love essential divine being. So that coheres. You don't have to believe it, but whenever you test a paradigm, look for contradictions, look for incoherence in one of its assumptions as it fights another one. Like Adya's innocent, the seeker must die in order to find what the seeker wants.
Yeah.
Right. But the seeker is not an illusion here. And so once you say the seeker is an illusion, it still coheres for Buddhism, because the seeker is an illusion, and the illusion is in the way of the not that you really are made of, quote unquote.
Which is better.
But
they can't admit, but it is. Because it's not supposed to be dualistic.
Yes,
but it is better.
Yes. Yeah. So that was a lot crammed in the last 5 minutes, but that's where we'll take off next time. All the ramifications of being emotive first, which in the end, we make the final link back to our first statements, is that if we're emotive first, the personal is not impedimentary to spirit. Because we're God first points of light inside its universe.
It also would imply that God is working out a lot about its own nature as love, because we're working out our own nature as emotion.
If we don't, back to a middle point in this podcast, we're not giving it venue through the human race. Mm-hmm. We can't until we identify ourselves as emotive first in coherence with it. We inhere and cohere that emotivity. If it can't breathe through, divine being can breathe through anyone who inhabits and starts to embody their emotive first and doesn't negativize any emotion beyond finding it. The root of it is only hurt and woundingness.
And this is witnessed in people who do the work that you created. The amazing, to me, it never ceases to amaze me how emotive level work actually releases and enhances spiritual gifts and accesses without any intention whatsoever to do so.
If you have, and we'll get to this probably in the next podcast, if you have innate access to enlightened states. So let's say you were enlightened in 10 other lifetimes, Joseph.
Let's just say.
Let's just say 10. No, I'm sorry. Let's say 11. In Edenity's dharmic universe, just doing emotive personal work will trigger and release in your soul field your access to your past life enlightenments. No meditation required.
Or at least very little.
Very little.
And because the alternative is all of that soul resource is locked away under the defenses of emotion, of emotivity, and then you've got to start from scratch. It's like, being a really in shape runner and, picking up, tying some ankle weights to yourself, 50 pounds of ankle weights, and running the race.
Yes.
Whereas you actually already have the power to get there.
Already. It's just we haven't decoded the God thing all the way down to the personal thing, like we've done, like Edenity does. Offers it to anyone that it speaks to. If it doesn't speak to you, God, stick with what you're doing until it dead ends with you, and be curious about how you might have already dead ended and you're not aware of it yet. That's also possible true. So the personal is just as inherently spiritual. It's not an illusion. Zen is wrong. Sorry, even though it has enormous expansions of consciousness possible to it. The basic premise is a problem, and that's how we'll roll in the soul eye, which sits behind the personal eye that lives in the mind, and we'll decode that for Eastern esotericism next time.
Okay. All right. Well, I've written that down, so maybe we'll actually remember. I know you'll remember. I'll remember too.
Yes.
So let's close here. Stace, this was incredibly rich. Thank you. It was a real pleasure to hear some things. I'm always hearing things that I haven't heard before, but this was a big one for me, and I'm happy that it's Friday afternoon and I can digest some of these things for myself, because it rocked my world a little bit.
Well, and isn't that the most amazing informational basis of all, when in a conversation you actually have a moment that can be transparently imparted to your listeners of, oh my God, not omniscient, not omnipotent. This scares me a little. And that's exactly the fearful terrain we have to cross, that fearful desert that doesn't negativize any emotion past a certain point of finding its root is wounded. So you helped a lot of people today just by being transparent with your reaction to that ridiculously daring teaching that God's not omniscient nor omnipotent.
Yes.
Neither.
In another age, you would have been burned at the stake for saying such a thing.
Absolutely. Yes. And who knows, maybe assassinated or burned at the stake this lifetime by some rabid religionist who doesn't realize that the degree they hold absolute truth about their religion is the degree they have doubt in it.
Yeah.
Well, there's a juicy topic also.
Yeah.
So, because if someone who encounters the real God doesn't need to believe in it anymore.
Okay. Well, thanks again. And thank you for listening, listeners. And I hope you'll join us next time for the next 2 and 3 part of second and third part of this series. Until then, we wish you well. Thanks for listening to the Heart of Soul podcast. To learn more about Stace Barron and Edenity, please visit edenity.org. To learn more about Joseph Shapiro, visit clearandopen.com. Until next time, we wish you well on your journey.